As the old man got up, he told Shawnee, Lisa, and Tawny to follow him into the house. "What about us?" Tommy shrieked. "I decided you should stay here, my boy. It wouldn't be prudent to take a chance of a ghost of a hagborn having access to my facilities. That could have tragic consequences for everyone." "What about me, Granddad?" asked Sid. He looked at Sid tediously. "You gentlemen should stay here and keep an eye on Tommy in case he has another bad turn." "And what if he does? What do we do?" asked Sid, obviously becoming more distraught. The old man just pointed to the cabinet against the back wall and herded the girls out the door. Meanwhile, Sid and David ran to the cabinet and opened it to find some old, thick change coiled on the bottom of the shelf. They looked at each other, then Sid looked at David, jerking his head towards Tommy. When the girls and Sid's granddad got to the house, he led them to a heavy oak door leading to the attic on the other side of the kitchen. It had a huge iron lock attached to a metal bar that laid across it. He opened it and lit a match as they walked up the gloomy stairs. When they got to the top, he turned on the lights, and the girls were gobsmacked by what they saw. On one side, there were two bookshelves about 10 feet across, filled to capacity with books, along with 3 two-foot stacks on the floor. The other side had 2 tables with large and small bottles of chemicals and all sorts of plants and herbs, and a cabinet like the one in the shed. This too was locked with a large steel lock. "Okay, ladies, the right shelf has the volumes on malefic beasties. Have a go." He then walked to the table and started fumbling with the bottles one by one. As the girls grabbed some books off the shelves, Shawnee asked, "What are we looking for anyway, sir?" "Call me Codger. Anything related to demigods, spirits, or creatures. Look for ancient testaments, poems, musings, anything like that." Then Lisa remarked, "These books don't look very old." "Well, that's because they're English translations from Jewish, Greek, Latin, Arabic, and so forth. I've never been good at languages. Now can we focus on the task at hand, please?" Then he set a few of the bottles to the side and grabbed a mortar and pestle and began grinding the contents of the vials together. As the girls sat against the wall and began reading. Back in the shack, Sid and David were pulling the iron chains from the cabinet and was about to carry them to where Tommy was sitting back with his eyes closed, when all of a sudden he opened his eyes and lunged forward. Sid and David froze in their tracks. Tommy blurted out, "We need some goddamn music." With that, he walked to the radio and turned it to full volume. "Stairway to Heaven" was just starting, and Tommy sank back into his chair, not paying attention to Sid and David, and closed his eyes. Willie looked at Sid and David as they slowly walked toward Tommy and set the chains as slowly and quietly as they could next to the wall behind his chair. Then they sat back down next to Willie and kept their eyes fixed on Tommy. Sid then whispered to Willie, "Hey man, I need to take a leak." The only place to go was behind the shack. "I'll go with you," said Willie. Sid told David to keep an eye on Tommy, and if something happens, just holler, and they went outside. David looked at Tommy, just swooning to the music. He backed at the door, clenching his fists nervously, and then he saw, out the corner of his eye, an old Louisville Slugger leaning against the corner. He got up quickly and grabbed it and sat back down, clutching it tightly next to him. and fixed his eyes nervously at Tommy. In the attic, Lisa thought she may have found something. Codger stopped what he was doing and shuffled over there. She was holding open a book called The Absolutes of Grievous Deities, a 16th century bestiary from an unknown author found in a legend Pelagian's castle in Germany in the 1800s. "Let's see what you found, my dear." Turned out it was an account of a godling that ravaged a coven of wenches in the 10th century. One did conceive, and the others didn't, and she was spared, but the others were buried alive. Okay, this might be what we needed. He grabbed the book and walked back to the table, browsing through the pages as he walked. Behind the shack, Sid and Willie were talking as Sid relieved himself. Willie asked Sid, "Do you really think Tommy has a demon ghost inside him? I mean, I know we've been having a blast hanging with Tommy and talking about devils, witchcraft, and monsters, but personally, I never believed in that shit. I just wanted to get high and hear creepy stories. And that's all they were, stories, right?" Sid didn't answer him. "Right?" Willie yelled. "That's what I thought too, dude," he said. "It was all just make-believe and superstition. But what he did in the park, lifted me off the ground with one arm, and his eyes, black as coal, there's just no other explanation I can think of." Sid put his hand on Willie's shoulder. "Don't worry about it, dude. I'm sure Granddad will figure out what to do. He's always been an eccentric old guy, but I always felt safe when he was around." Then Sid zipped up and they headed back inside. The girls gathered around Codger, as they began to call him, and watched him grind away, reading at the same time. "Shawnee, my dear, could you plug in that hot plate for me and turn it up to high, please?" As she did, Lisa asked him, "What are you making, sir? Will that cure Tommy?" "I hope so, little lady. It's been about 30 years since I've had to deal with this sort of thing," Tony chimed in. "So you've done this before, sir?" He raised his head and sighed. "You have no idea, child, of the scourges the cosmos and all of its realms have spawned since the inception of life and death, innumerable years ago. I'll tell you about it one day, but let's get through the night first," he said as he continued with his mixing and grinding. The girls were obviously getting more and more uneasy as they watched him grab a small cast iron cauldron and place it on the hot plate and empty the mortar into it. Then he grabbed a jar with some kind of purple liquid inside, and as he poured it into the heating cauldron, a wisp of violet steam floated into the air, forming a woman's silhouette with her arms in the air. They all stepped back in fright as it dissipated in just a moment. Codger smiled and told them not to worry. "That's the paleo goddess, or mother as some call her. She has given us her blessing, so now we can begin." With that, he went back to the table and continued with his mixing. Sid opened the door to the shack, just enough to see inside. The radio was still blasting. Bohemian Rhapsody was on now, and Tommy was still lying back with his eyes closed and his arms to his side. Sid motioned to David to come outside. He got up slowly, keeping his eyes on Tommy, and creeped outside. "Keep the door cracked and keep an eye on Tommy," Sid told him. "He looks like he's asleep, man. He hasn't moved for a while." David said, "Good. I was thinking, if he's asleep, now would be a good time to chain him to the chair." The other two looked at Sid like he was crazy. Willie shook his head. What if he wakes up before we can get him chained? There's three of us. We can handle it, Sid said. They looked at each other and nodded yes. Okay, Willie, you keep an eye on him while me and David chain him up. If he moves at all, holler. Got it? They creeped up to Tommy's chair. Sid and David quietly picked up the chains and slowly walked toward the other side of the chair. Tommy let out a little snore, freezing the three in their tracks. Willie mouthed out that he thinks he's still asleep. So they laid the chain on his chest and walked around the chair, gingerly tightening the chain around him. Willie gave the okay signal, and they latched the chain together with a piece of copper wire. They all sighed a sigh of relief and sat back down and gave each other a quiet high five. Sid turned the radio down a bit and pulled out a couple of beers out the ice chest. After they made a toast, they downed their beers and they looked at Tommy. His eyes were open, staring at them, and they were black as pitch with white pupils, and he was smiling. Codger was meticulously measuring the contents of about 10 bottles when Shawnee walked up to him and asked him nervously, "We won't have to kill him, will we?" He stopped what he was doing and looked at her, not saying a word. He placed his hand on her cheek, and he could feel her trembling. He gave her a wink and continued what he was doing. Then she sank back against the wall and sat on the floor and began to cry. The other girls sat next to her, and they all hugged each other. A couple of minutes later, his head popped up, and then they heard a door crashing open downstairs. They heard the sound of running footsteps coming up the stairs. Codger grabbed a scimitar from under a box and headed for the door. Before he reached it, Sid and Willie burst through the door and fell to the floor. Sid looked up at his grandfather, obviously terrified and bloodied. "Tommy, it killed David." Codger grabbed a bottle of some kind of liquid and poured it over the sword as he hollered for everyone to stay put. He pulled the two panic-stricken boys away from the door and headed down the stairs. When he got to the shack, he muttered some charm and slowly creeped inside, holding the sword at the ready, still dripping the potion he poured on it. The lights were still on, and he could see David's broken body lying atop the toppled cabinet with his limbs barely attached. And the chair Tommy was sitting in was broken in two, and the chains that bound him scattered across the shack. As he turned to go back to the house, he saw the kids standing just outside the back door. He then closed the door to the shack and locked it and walked back to the house. "What are we going to do, Grandpa?" Sid cried. "I think we're going to need some help," he said.